Have you ever looked up from your phone and realized an hour had slipped away, yet you couldn't even remember what you were looking at? Have you ever sat through a conversation, nodding and responding, only to realize later that you hadn't truly been there at all? Bill never used to think much about it. He had always believed that being present meant simply existing in a space. But one quiet afternoon changed everything. He was sitting in his recliner, the same chair that had molded to his body over the years. His phone sat in his hands, glowing faintly in the dim afternoon light. His thumb scrolled mindlessly, news, headlines, a few photos, a weather update. Outside, laughter rang through the backyard, pure, joyful, unfiltered. He glanced up. Sophie, his 6-year-old granddaughter, was spinning in circles, arms stretched wide, chasing a butterfly. The sunlight danced in her golden curls, her giggles rising like music. Bill smiled. I should go out there, he thought. I'll just finish this article first. Minutes passed. Then an hour. When he finally looked up again, the yard was empty. Sophie was gone. The butterfly had disappeared. The laughter had faded into memory. And Bill had missed it. A strange emptiness settled in his chest. He set his phone down, the screen going dark, his own reflection staring back at him. How many moments like this had he let slip away? That evening, at dinner, his daughter, Emily, studied him carefully. She had been watching him for months. How the man who once filled the room with stories now sat in silence, his eyes fixed on a screen. She sighed and set down her fork. Dad, you're here, but you're not really here. Bill forced a chuckle. I am here. I'm just catching up on some news. Emily shook her head. No, Dad. You're somewhere else. And honestly, I miss you. I miss the real you. The one who used to play with me, who used to listen, who used to be present. Now it's like you disappear into that screen. Her words hit harder than he expected. They weren't spoken in frustration, but in quiet sorrow. The kind of sorrow that comes from watching someone fade away, even while they're still right in front of you. That night, Bill lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, sleep refusing to come. He thought about Sophie's laughter, about the moments that had slipped away unnoticed. He thought about Emily's voice, heavy with sadness. He thought about all the things he used to love, books that sat untouched on the shelf, records that had not been played in years, conversations that once filled the house with warmth. He turned his head toward his nightstand. His phone sat there, lifeless, yet it had a grip on him stronger than he ever realized. He could see his reflection faintly in the dark screen. A man who had let time pass him by. A man who was living, but not truly alive. And in that quiet moment, Bill made a decision. Not a dramatic one, not the kind that comes with grand resolutions or overnight transformation. Just a simple, quiet promise to himself to be here, to be present, to live. And maybe, just maybe, that's where happiness truly begins. The morning air carried a stillness Bill hadn't felt in years. He stepped onto the porch, his hands empty, his phone abandoned inside. It was such a small thing, leaving it behind. And yet, his fingers twitched at his sides, restless, searching for something to do, something to hold, something to keep him from the discomfort of just being. For years, his mornings had been the same. A screen in his hand before his feet even touched the floor. Headlines, notifications, a flood of updates about a world that felt more distant with every swipe. And yet, he checked them anyway. The habit was so ingrained, so automatic, that he never stopped to question it. Until now. Until Emily's voice, heavy with sadness, whispered in his head, Dad, I miss you. The real you. The thought unsettled him. Had he really been gone, even while sitting right there? A soft wind moved through the trees, their leaves rustling like an invitation. He let out a slow breath and sat down, his body stiff from years of stillness. And then he listened. Not just with his ears, but with something deeper, something quieter, something he hadn't used in far too long. The birds called out to one another, their songs layered like an old melody he'd forgotten the tune to. Somewhere, a neighbor's wind chime danced with the breeze. In the distance, the sound of a child's laughter, bright, untamed, full of life. His coffee sat beside him, untouched. When he finally took a sip, he expected it to be lukewarm, as it always was by the time he remembered to drink it. But today, it was still warm. He swallowed, the bitter richness lingering on his tongue. When was the last time I drank my coffee while it was still hot? He couldn't remember. The realization hit harder than it should have. The day passed slowly, and yet, when evening fell, old habits crept in like shadows. He reached for the remote, ready to let the television fill the silence. It would be easy, so easy, to fall back into the familiar rhythm of numbing the night away, letting the hours dissolve into flickering lights and background noise. But as his fingers brushed against the remote, his gaze landed on something else. A book. It sat untouched on the shelf, its spine worn, its pages yellowed with time. Margaret's favorite. She had read it so many times, always insisting that every reread revealed something new, something she hadn't seen before. He had never understood that. To him, stories were meant to be read once, absorbed, and put away. But Margaret had seen them differently. His chest ached at the thought of her, at the way she used to curl up on the couch, completely lost in another world, her lips sometimes moving as she read her favorite passages under her breath, at the way she had tried again and again to get him to read alongside her. "You might like it, Bill," she would say, nudging the book toward him. "You just have to give it time." He never had. There had always been something else, some show to watch, some email to check, some distraction pulling him away. He reached for the book now, his hands settling into the familiar grooves where hers once rested. The pages crackled softly as he opened it, the scent of old paper and forgotten time wrapped around him. And then, for the first time in longer than he cared to admit, he let himself get lost. Not in a screen, not in a headline designed to provoke, not in the endless scroll of other people's lives, but in a story, a real, tangible story. And in that quiet, something shifted. The dinner table had always been a place of comfort for Bill, a familiar rhythm in a life that had seen so many changes. A big breakfast, a second helping at dinner, a handful of snacks while watching television. He ate not because he was truly hungry, but because it was what he had always done. Food had become another habit, another distraction, something that filled the empty spaces in his day, just like his phone once had. But now that he had started paying attention, truly paying attention, he began to wonder, had he ever really tasted any of it? One evening, he sat across from James at their usual diner, the low hum of conversation filling the air. Bill glanced down at his plate, the food piled high as it always was. Across from him, James' plate sat half empty, his fork resting beside it. "Not hungry?" Bill asked, halfway through his own meal, his stomach already feeling heavier than he would have liked. James leaned back, shaking his head with an easy smile. "I just eat until I'm satisfied, not stuffed. Makes me feel lighter." The words struck Bill harder than he expected. He looked down at his own plate, suddenly realizing he wasn't eating because he was hungry. He was eating because the food was there, because he had always cleaned his plate, just like his mother had taught him. Because something about an empty plate made him feel like he had done something right. But when had eating become a task rather than an experience? When had he stopped savoring the taste, the texture, the warmth of a good meal? That night, back at home, he stood in the kitchen, staring at his reflection in the darkened window. His stomach felt full, too full. But beyond that, there was a deeper weight, a heaviness that had nothing to do with food. It was the realization of how much of his life he had spent going through the motions, never questioning, never really noticing. The next morning, he decided to try something different. He took a smaller plate, serving himself less than usual. At first, it felt wrong, like he was breaking an unspoken rule. But as he lifted the first bite to his mouth, he did something he hadn't done in years. He slowed down. He let the flavors unfold one by one, each more vivid than he remembered. The crunch of fresh vegetables, the rich bitterness of his morning coffee, the soft sweetness of fruit. How had he not noticed these things before? But change never comes easy. The first few days, he caught himself reaching for more out of habit, the old rhythm pulling at him like a song stuck in his head. His hands hesitated over the serving spoon, his mind whispering, just a little more. But then he would remember the way James had leaned back with ease, how light he had looked, how free. And Bill wanted that. He wanted to feel free. As the weeks passed, something shifted. He no longer left the table feeling weighed down. He stopped eating simply because the food was there and started eating because he wanted to, because it brought him joy. A warm bowl of soup on a cold evening, a slice of bread with butter melting into its surface, the slow pleasure of dark chocolate after dinner. Each bite felt intentional, each meal an experience rather than a routine. And then, one evening, as he sat across from James once again, he found himself setting his fork down before his plate was empty. He took a sip of coffee, the steam curling in the dim light of the diner, and for the first time in years, he felt full not from food, but from the simple act of slowing down, of being present, of truly tasting life. James caught his eye, a knowing smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Bill let out a soft chuckle, shaking his head. "I think you might be onto something," he said. And as he left the table that night, stepping into the cool evening air, he felt something else, lighter, yes, but also clearer, as if he had peeled away a layer of fog he hadn't even known was there. The first time Bill noticed how much time he spent sitting was when he tried to stand up, and his body protested. His knees ached, his back felt stiff, and for a moment, he had to steady himself before taking a step. It hadn't always been this way. He remembered a time when getting up was effortless, when walking across the room didn't require a moment of hesitation. But slowly, without him realizing, stillness had crept into his life like an old habit, settling into his bones, making itself comfortable. He had never been the type to go to the gym, and the idea of structured exercise felt exhausting before he had even begun. But as he rubbed his knee absent-mindedly, he thought about something his doctor had once said: "You don't have to run marathons. You just have to keep moving." So he started small. During commercial breaks, instead of sitting through them, he stood up. Sometimes he stretched his arms above his head, rolling his shoulders to shake off the stiffness. Other times, he took a slow lap around the living room, just enough to remind his body that it wasn't meant to stay in one place for too long. At first, it didn't feel like much. But then, one afternoon, he caught himself waiting at the door for the mailman to drop off his letters, something he had done for years. Without thinking, he stepped outside instead, walking down the driveway to retrieve the mail himself. The air was crisp, the pavement warm beneath his feet. It was such a small thing, a few extra steps, a few more breaths of fresh air. But when he walked back inside, he felt different, just a little more awake, a little more alive. And so he kept going. Each time he needed something from the kitchen, he took the long way around. Instead of parking himself in his chair after breakfast, he stepped outside for a few minutes, letting the morning sun warm his face. When he talked on the phone, he paced the room instead of sitting still. Movement became part of his day, not as a task, not as something to check off a list, but as something natural, something woven into the rhythm of his life. Over time, his body began to respond. His knees, once reluctant to bear his weight, felt stronger. His back, which used to ache after long periods of sitting, no longer protested as much. Even his energy shifted. Where he once felt sluggish by mid-afternoon, he now found himself reaching for his shoes, stepping outside just because it felt good. The best part? He never felt like he was exercising. There was no pressure, no goal to meet, no distance to track. He was simply moving, reclaiming the ease he had once taken for granted. And in doing so, he realized something simple yet profound. Motion was not just about keeping the body strong. It was about staying engaged with life, about refusing to let stillness settle in places it didn't belong. And as long as he kept moving, even in the smallest of ways, he knew he was still very much alive. For most of his life, Bill had told himself that he was just a night owl. He convinced himself that the quiet of late hours was when he felt most at peace, when he could sit alone with his thoughts, letting the world slow down around him. But over time, he had stopped using those late hours for anything meaningful. Instead of reading, he scrolled. Instead of unwinding, he numbed himself with television. Instead of finding peace, he lost sleep. At first, he didn't question it. After all, what difference did it make if he went to bed at midnight or 1 in the morning? But then, morning after morning, he woke up feeling drained before the day had even begun. The coffee that once felt like a pleasant ritual became a necessity, something he clung to just to shake off the weight of another restless night. His body ached more, his thoughts felt slower, and no matter how long he stayed in bed, he never truly felt rested. One evening, as he sat in his recliner, the blue light of the television flickering against the walls, he thought about something Emily had said to him weeks ago. "Dad, I miss you." At the time, he had assumed she meant their conversations, their connection. But now, as he rubbed his tired eyes, he realized something: she hadn't just lost him to screens or distractions. She had lost him to exhaustion, to the slow erosion of his energy, his clarity, his presence. That night, instead of reaching for the remote, he reached for a book. It had been sitting by his bedside for months, its pages untouched. The first few minutes were restless. His mind itched for the stimulation of flashing lights and background noise. But then, something shifted. The words on the page drew him in, pulling him away from the habit of passive distraction. By the time he set the book down, his eyelids were heavy, not from the forced exhaustion of a late night, but from the natural rhythm of his body finally being heard. He turned off the light and lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the stillness of his home. And for the first time in years, the silence wasn't something he needed to fill. The next morning, he woke up before his alarm, a gentle light spilling through the curtains. He stretched, his body less stiff than usual, his mind clearer. The day stretched ahead of him, not as something to push through, but as something to step into with ease. It wasn't an instant transformation. There were nights when the temptation of just one more episode crept in, when the habit of staying up late whispered its familiar invitation. But each time he chose to put the screens away, each time he chose rest over restlessness, he woke up feeling just a little lighter. Mornings, once a struggle, became a quiet kind of gift. The first sip of coffee tasted richer. The sunlight felt warmer on his skin. And somewhere in that simple shift, from fighting the morning to embracing it, Bill realized that maybe happiness wasn't something he had to chase. Maybe it was something as simple as waking up with enough energy to truly enjoy the day. For most of his life, Bill had prided himself on being dependable. He was the one people could count on, the friend who never missed a dinner, the neighbor who always showed up to help, the family member who attended every gathering no matter how tired he felt. He said yes because it felt like the right thing to do. He said yes because he didn't want to disappoint anyone. But over time, something had shifted. The invitations that once felt warm now felt like obligations. The gatherings that once filled him with joy now left him feeling drained. One afternoon, as he sat at his kitchen table, he glanced at the calendar pinned to the fridge. Nearly every day had something scribbled onto it: a lunch here, a favor there, a birthday party, a meeting, a gathering. It was full, yet looking at it made him feel empty. When had his time stopped feeling like his own? He had never thought of saying no as an option. But that day, for the first time, he considered it. Not to everything, not to the people he loved, but to the things that no longer brought him joy. He didn't need to be at every event. He didn't have to say yes just because he always had before. The first time he declined an invitation, it felt strange, almost as if he were breaking an unspoken rule. But the world didn't end. No one was angry. In fact, most people hardly noticed. And in the space left behind, something unexpected happened. He found himself more present in the moments he did choose. Instead of rushing from one obligation to the next, he lingered in conversations that truly mattered. Instead of filling his days with social noise, he made time for quiet dinners with old friends, for long walks where he could actually hear his own thoughts. He realized that connection wasn't about how many events he attended or how many people he kept in touch with. It was about depth, about presence, about truly showing up for the moments that counted. And as he let go of the pressure to be everywhere, to be everything to everyone, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Lighter, happier, free. Bill hadn't set out to change his life. He hadn't chased some grand transformation or sought to become a different person. He had simply started paying attention to the weight of his own habits, to the small moments he had been overlooking, to the quiet pull of a life that felt lighter, freer. It wasn't about doing more, but about letting go. And in that letting go, he discovered something unexpected, not the feeling of loss, but the feeling of coming home to himself. For the first time in years, he woke up with energy instead of exhaustion. He moved through his days with a sense of ease, no longer burdened by the noise of distractions or the pressure of obligations that no longer served him. He ate with intention, he rested with purpose, he spent his time where it truly mattered. And in the process, he realized that happiness had never been something he needed to chase. It had always been there, waiting in the spaces he had been too busy to notice. There is a quiet wisdom that comes with age and understanding that life isn't about how much we do, but how deeply we experience it. We spend so many years running and chasing success, keeping up with expectations, filling every empty space with noise, until one day we realize that what we were looking for was never in the rush, but in the stillness, in the conversations that linger, in the meals we truly savor, in the mornings where we wake without urgency but with gratitude. Bill's story isn't just his, it belongs to anyone who has ever felt the weight of time slipping by too fast, anyone who has ever longed to slow down and truly live. Maybe in some way it belongs to you too. So take a moment, breathe, ask yourself what is worth holding on to and what is finally time to release. And if this story resonated with you, if you find comfort in life's simple lessons, consider subscribing to Elderly Wisdom Story, because wisdom isn't just found in books or history. It's in the moments we pause, the stories we tell, and the lessons that shape the way we live. And sometimes all it takes is one small shift to bring us back to what truly matters.